Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in the Mighty Dozen, the 9 friends had gotten together at James and Carly's house and are now about to encounter the meteor. And we will finally meet the other 3 characters in this movie, completing the so-called Mighty Dozen. This is going to be a pretty long chapter, probably one of the longest in the book. But you ready? Alright. Let's begin. Chapter 5. The Glowing Meteor. After dinner, everybody went down the stairs out back to the garage. The houses in the area, along with the road, were on a big hill, and waited for Frank to come out with the old camp bus. As there was no ramp or elevator, getting Reginald down was tricky. Instead, James and Carly carried the wheelchair to the bottom of the stairs, while Richard and Christy carried Reginald down the stairs themselves. Then the 4 of them placed him back in the wheelchair. Luckily, Frank had a movable makeshift ramp to get him in and out of the bus. "Did you lock up?" asked Carly. "Taken care of," replied James, holding up his keys before putting them in his pocket. At last all was ready, and the garage door opened, and out came the bus. It looked like a medium-sized school bus, which it used to be, but it had a beautiful multicolored paint job, like the bus used in the Muppet movie 2 years earlier. Well, this does take place in 1981, so this is 2 years after the Muppet movie. The doors opened, and there was Frank at the wheel, beaming with excitement. "All aboard," he announced. "Okay, everybody, single file, no pushing and shoving," James was saying. The others boarded except James and Carly. Once their friends were on board, James stepped on, but Carly cleared her throat loudly. "Hold on a minute." James sighed in exasperation. "What is it, Carly?" "You said we were both in charge," said Carly haughtily. "So why are you giving out all the orders, Just because you're older than me by 6 months and have had a little more experience as a police detective than me does not automatically mean you can give out all the orders. It's like you think you're so special." James's brow furrowed as he slowly stepped down from the bus and came to ground level, face to face with Carly. Unknown to them, everybody, including Frank, was leaning against the windows to see what was going on. Although Carly was not a small young lady, she was 5 feet 4 inches tall, the average height of a woman, and weighed around 110 pounds. She certainly looked tiny compared to James, who was 6 feet 5 inches tall. 13 inches taller, and weighed at least 225 pounds, all muscle. He leaned into Carly's face so close that they could only see each other's eyes, James's big brown eyes staring hard into Carly's brilliant green ones. "Listen to me very closely, Catherine, because I'm only going to say this once," said James quietly and sternly. Carly nodded, and did her best not to show any fear or intimidation. "What we're dealing with is something from out of our world, something glowing with radiation, something that could risk our lives if we're not careful. I don't want to lose any of you, especially not you. I can't bear the thought of losing you, so I'm going to take charge for the most part. But I will still let you give orders too. But unless you want to get yourself or any of us killed, accident or not, don't screw with me. No arguments. Is that in any way unclear?" Although Carly hated it when anyone spoke to her like this, she knew there was some truth in what James was saying. Besides, she herself knew the dangers involved. "Perfectly clear," she said at last. James nodded sternly. "After you, sweetheart," he said, gesturing to the bus. "Thank you, baby," said Carly sweetly, but with a glowering look on her face. She boarded the bus. As soon as Carly climbed on the bus, the others, who were squeezing against the windows, immediately hurried back to their seats. Carly noticed this, as did James, who followed her closely behind. "I'm not even going to ask," said Carly in exasperation. Without another word, Carly sat in the back with Christy, while Richard, who was sitting in the front behind Frank, scooted over and allowed James to sit next to him and take the window seat. With that, Frank sealed the doors closed and drove off. "You know how to get there?" James asked. "Of course. I have here a map," replied Frank, pointing to a map that was spread out on his lap. "Very good then," said James, sitting back. "If you ask me," Frank went on quietly, "you shouldn't take that crap from Carly. Maybe if she was roughened up a bit, she wouldn't behave like such a diva." "Stop it, Frank," said Richard sternly. "Sounds like you don't know the first thing about how relationships work." "At least Christy doesn't give you any trouble, Richie," retorted Frank. "She may be too headstrong at times, but at least she doesn't act like an asshole." "Please don't bring Christy into this," said Richard exasperatedly. "I was only making a compliment," said Frank, shrugging. James sighed heavily and slumped his shoulders. "What am I going to do with her?" Realizing he was talking about Carly, Richard put his arm around James and patted him on the back. Seeing them through the reflection of the dashboard, Frank decided it would be best to keep his big mouth shut until they got to Pyramid Lake. Meanwhile, at Pyramid Lake, not too far where the glowing meteor had landed, there was a campfire blazing near an old picnic area by the lakeshore. Around it were 3 kids around junior high school age. One was a small, skinny black boy with an afro, wearing a striped t-shirt and jeans. One was a lanky boy in a plain t-shirt and gym shorts, and one was a lanky girl in a tank top and jeans. They were Eddie McDowell, Peter Burkhart, and Clara Burkhart, respectively. And yes, these are the remaining 3 characters of the Mighty Dozen. As I had mentioned in the prologue, Peter and Clara were fraternal twins. Both of them had bright blue eyes and golden yellow hair. Peter's was short but untidy, and Clara's was wavy and waist-length. You also know that they escaped from an orphanage in Reno about a week before our story began. What you don't know is how they managed to survive these last few days. But you're about to find out now. The 3 of them were sitting around the campfire roasting marshmallows. All of their belongings were with them, surrounding the fire. They were good kids, though they did have a tendency to be mischievous at times. "Great idea to come out to Pyramid Lake, Clara," said Peter. "Who'd have thought the meteor would just happen to land where the old camping grounds were?" Clara laughed. "And we'll be able to see James and Carly taking on the mission," said Eddie excitedly. "You sure they're the ones coming?" "I'm sure, Eddie," replied Clara. "You heard what the store clerk was saying when we were getting food for our campout. Mayor Goodman specifically wanted James Reitherman and Catherine Nordberg to take the case. She prefers Carly, remember?" Peter corrected her. "I remember, Peter. We all went to the camp at one point. Don't think I... Oh!" Clara had accidentally burnt her marshmallow and fire was glowing all around it. Peter blew it out for her, then handed her another marshmallow. "Thanks," said Clara gratefully as Peter nodded. "Speaking of which," said Eddie, "remember when we first met at the camp 5 years ago? The year of the bicentennial?" Peter asked. "That's the year," said Eddie. "James and Carly were made junior counselors that year, and boy did we have some great memories on the lake." Peter and Clara grinned sheepishly and glanced at each other. If you want to know what happened 5 years ago, I'll be brief. While it was one of the best years for the camp, there was one incident that involved these 3 kids. One day in the middle of July of 1976, Eddie and Peter were proudly showing off some cool remote-controlled trucks from the makers of Hot Wheels to James, Richard, and Frank. The other campers were impressed, but unfortunately it had rained the night before, so the dirt grounds were muddy and wet. At one point, Eddie's and Peter's trucks got stuck in the mud, and they had to try every trick with their remotes before the trucks got unstuck. By the time they did, though, they had accidentally splattered James, Richard, and Frank with mud. All 3 of them were furious. Yes, even Richard. Not a good sign. Meanwhile, in the mess hall, Clara, who had learned to make strawberry banana milkshakes with her mother at home, wanted to demonstrate for the campers. Arthur said she could, as long as Carly and Christy were supervising. However, the blender Clara was using was not working properly. Presumably, because Clara overloaded it or forgot to close the lid all the way. The blender went berserk, and while the other campers backed away, Carly and Christy had to stop the blender themselves by ultimately unplugging it. To their chagrin, Carly and Christy were splattered in milkshake, and they were not at all happy. What happened was this. While Pedro was coming back from canoeing with 3 other campers, he thought he saw Eddie, Peter, and Clara running through the woods, with James, Carly, Frank, Richard, and Christy angrily chasing after them. Later, Gary and Joey came back from hiking with a group of campers and had just come back to the mess hall when they heard shouting and peeked in through the windows. Eddie, Peter, and Clara were sitting with their heads hanging, while James, Carly, Frank, Richard, and Christy harshly scolded them for their antics. Long story short, the 3 of them were not banned from the camp, although they were not allowed to use their trucks or make milkshakes for the remainder of camp that year. Arthur also sternly reprimanded James and Carly and the other 3 for being too harsh on the kids, but nevertheless he still understood their feelings. Anyways, back to the main story. Eddie, Peter, and Clara looked at each other funny as if they were trying hard to stifle their laughter. "Well, we did cause trouble for them," said Clara, embarrassed. "At least Gary and Joey never yelled at us," said Peter. "Or that other kid," said Eddie, trying to remember. What was his name? Pablo? Pedro, Peter and Clara corrected him. "Oh, right. I liked him, and he really loved nature walks." "Do you think the others have forgotten about the incident?" asked Peter. "I only asked because we're hoping to stay with James and Carly." "I hope so," sighed Clara. "It's been 6 days since we left the orphanage, and we're almost out of food and money. And I'm getting tired of walking so fast to keep up with you guys," said Eddie, massaging his legs. "Sorry, Eddie," said Peter. "We can't help it if our legs are a lot longer. We both had growth spurts over the last year." "I know that." Just then the 3 of them heard something in the distance, and when they turned to look, there were headlights coming closer and getting brighter. "It's them," cried Clara. "Hurry, Peter, put out the fire." Peter grabbed a bucket full of lake water and put out the fire. "Damn it, I should have found the flashlights first." "Where did I put them?" Clara said. "I found them," cried Eddie, waving 3 flashlights over his head. Peter and Clara snatched 2 of them out of his hand. "Don't wave them around, you'll attract attention," snapped Peter. "Quiet, you 2, Clara whispered loudly. "Put your headgear on." They put their headgear on, which consisted of a frying pan for Clara, a pot for Peter, and a popcorn bowl for Eddie. "Just so my afro doesn't get ruined," Eddie was saying. Annoyed, Peter and Clara grabbed him and they hid behind a knocked-over picnic table as the bus